I think it's important that he hasn't shirked some of these significant cultural issues because it does matter. I mean, a country that doesn't fly the flag, a country that doesn't honour its history, is a country which doesn't have much of a future.
Australia is the greatest nation on earth. And at the referendum last year, Australians told the elites they want to keep it that way. Is 2024 the year mainstream Australians continue to secure our way of life, or will the elites strike back? In Season 3 of Australia's Future, former Prime Minister Tony Abbott will share his unique insight on the future of the Australian way of life.
Hello Tony, and g'day to all of our listeners. Great to be back for the final episode of 2024, where Tony will be sharing his insights on the year that has been and the year that will be for 2025. Tony, welcome back.
Dan, lovely to be with you.
All right, well, let's have a bit of a chat about 2024. I think it's been a pretty big year and a good year for mainstream Australians. I think it's the year of the fight back, where last year we won the Voice in defeating the Voice to Parliament comprehensively. This year we've seen, I think, Australia Day has largely been rescued. We've seen Peter Dutton's strong stand on the one flag as opposed to the three flags. We've also seen the defeat of the misinformation laws, which, as you and I have discussed, would have censored the opinions of mainstream Australians online, but had special protections for the elites in our society. So I'm very encouraged by what we've had this year. I think it's the strongest year we've had in terms of a pushback against the political establishment in Australia. And I think next year is going to be even stronger in my assessment. So interested in your views, Tony, on how you assess the year overall and what your key takeaways are.
Well, Dan, I think there is much to be encouraged by in the events of 2024, but I don't think we should be under any illusions about the mountain yet to be climbed ahead of us. You're right, last year's defeat of the Voice was absolutely seismic, and there have been some encouraging developments this year, such as the government's failure to proceed thus far with the misinformation and disinformation bill. But we still have a Green left government in this country. The long march of the left through the institutions has been very, very, very extensive. There are signs of a fight back, but by God, there's a long, long way to go. When I think back on this year, here in Australia, and obviously there are some further thoughts about what's been happening elsewhere, but when I think back on this year, I'm conscious of the fact that at least at the official level, left-wing governments have carried on as if the Voice defeat never happened. They're still pushing on with treaty. They're still pushing on with so-called truth-telling. We still have acknowledgements of country every time a plane lands. We still have three flags behind the Prime Minister. Our economic situation continues to be badly damaged by government, the same ruinous energy policy, the same addiction to tax and regulation. So yes, let's be encouraged, but let's be resolved to make next year locally much better by working might and main for the election of a much better government. And obviously our chance to do that will come sometime in the first half of next year. And as far as I'm concerned, the sooner the better.
Yeah, well, let's just pick up on something there, which is the welcome to country. So here in Melbourne, we've had Melbourne Storm, which is the NRL team for Melbourne, basically say they're going to wind back on their welcome to country performances. Last year, they only had 3 of them before the game. They've said that they're going to review them, and whether they're going to keep doing them or not is unclear. So, look, from my vantage point, this is a positive development. I think most people who go to sport have had enough of these never-ending ceremonies. Of course, they have a time and a place. But that time and place is not before
every single game
sport or every time a plane lands.
Exactly right. I mean, if you're in a Indigenous community, of course, we should pay tribute to the strengths and the successes of the community. During NAIDOC week, for argument's sake, it's appropriate to reflect on the contribution that Aboriginal people have made to our society. But the truth is, no Australian is more special than any other Australian. There have been many factors in our history. Yes, there's the Indigenous heritage, but absolutely there's our British foundation and the wonderful inheritance that we've had from Britain and from Western civilization more generally. And of course, there's the wonderful contribution that immigrants from the British Isles and indeed from all parts of the world have made to this country. And all should be honoured and celebrated. As we have been saying time and time again, singling just some out for special attention based on ancestry or length of time some of their ancestors have been in this country is just dead wrong. But as you say, there are some green shoots, and the fact that the Melbourne Storm have decided that they're going to scale it back, the fact that Geelong City Council have just announced that they're going to restore Australia Day. There are some green shoots as well as some ongoing disappointments.
Yeah, one of the things that gets me is, you mentioned, welcome to country when you're in an Indigenous community, but the activists hold that our entire nation is one big Indigenous community,
of course,
which is why they say that we have to have welcome to country, and that's why it's so demeaning and divisive.
And to these activists, the whole life of our nation has got to be one giant act of atonement for British settlement. Well, in fact, all of us should be grateful that Britain settled this country. Sure, not everything that's happened since the 26th of January 1788 has been good for everyone, but in the long run, all of us, Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal, are better off thanks to British civilisation, because not only did we get technology and science, we got the rule of law, we got democracy, we got notions of fundamental human equality, particularly the equality of women, which is why George Mai, the leader of the Torres Strait Islanders, told the Constitutional Convention back in 1998 that as far as he was concerned and his people were concerned, the coming of the Westerners, the coming of British civilisation, which also meant the coming of Christianity, was for them the coming of the light. And I think in broad terms, that's exactly what it was. It was the coming of the light to a continent which had been ancient and had, I suppose, witnessed the triumph of human survival. But there was so much more that we've been able to do since then, and thank God for that.
And this is obviously related to the three flags. You've been talking about this for some time. I thought it was excellent to see Peter Dutton say that as Prime Minister, he'll only stand in front of the Australian flag, at least on official business. Now, to me, this is utterly uncontroversial among mainstream Australians. The usual commentariat, are in a fuss about it. But a couple of things. Firstly, the flag is not just a piece of cloth. It's a symbol of our shared values, and also a statement, again, of sovereignty. Where you plant the flag is where it is sovereign.
Correct.
And again, having the three flags goes back to the activist idea that sovereignty was never ceded. That's why it's such an extreme thing. It's not just symbolism, it's actually foundational. So I'm very interested in your assessment of Peter Dutton's leadership on this matter.
Well, as you know, Dan, I think Peter Dutton has very substantially grown into the role of alternative Prime Minister. Not only did he keep the party together after a devastating defeat, but he showed a lot of courage in opposing the Voice at a time when it was still very popular. I think he showed a lot of courage in embracing nuclear energy as the only way to get to net zero, if we need to get to net zero, and keep the lights on. And I think it's important that he hasn't shirked some of these significant cultural issues, because it does matter. I mean, a country that doesn't fly the flag, a country that doesn't honour its history, is a country which doesn't have much of a future. I think we are the best country on earth. I want to keep us that way, and part of that is not just more jobs and a more dynamic economy and all the rest of it, but at the heart of it is faith in what we've achieved here and a determination to build on our strengths. I mean, if our best days really are ahead of us, as I believe they must always be, it's not by disowning our past, it's by celebrating the best that's been here on this continent, and making the most of it.
Well, unfortunately, here in Victoria, that message hasn't been received, with Premier Jacinta Allen saying that she's going to permanently cancel the Australia Day parade. So
Shameful, absolutely shameful, completely shameful. I mean, how can anyone who claims to be a leader of Australia not want to celebrate our country? And the best day to celebrate our country is the day modern Australia began, which was the 26th of January 1788, the day when Governor Phillip hoisted the Union Jack, toasted the King, and began a process which has produced this wonderful country, which again I stress has an Indigenous heritage, a British foundation and an immigrant character, and we should be pleased and proud of all three essential elements in what makes up modern Australia.
And this is an activist government. I mean, the statement here was, we recognise that the 26th of January means different things to different people. On this day, we encourage conversation and reflection on the different meanings of the day for all Victorians. I wonder what they're referring to there. But of course, Daniel Andrews sort of kiboshed it under the guise of COVID, knowing full well that it will probably be terminal, and Jacinta Allen has carried this on. So also in Victoria, Moira Deeming. So this has been an important development. So Moira Deeming was found to have been defamed by John Pizzuto. There's $300,000 in damages, court order, plus however much more in terms of the various costs, potentially up to $2 million. And basically what the judge found was anyone listening to the various statements from John Pizzuto would have concluded that Moira Deeming associates with Nazis and thus is unfit to be member of the Parliamentary Liberal Party. So this is quite a significant judgment. What's your assessment of what this judgment means in the context of the broader cultural debate, and then what does it mean for the Victorian Liberal Party's future?
Well, it was a very significant judgment, and frankly it was a pretty damning judgment for John Pizzuto. I mean, the judge also said that far from acting to uphold the standing and the reputation of the Parliament, he was really acting because he was frightened of what Dan Andrews might make of the fact that the neo-Nazis gate-crashed the women's rights rally that Moira had helped to organise. So it was really, if you like, a function of the fact that he was a bit intimidated by Dan Andrews that drove John Pizzuto to defame Moira Deeming. It also appears from the judgment that the judge felt that John Pizzuto never really thought she was an associate of neo-Nazis or a disgraceful individual, because let's face it, he'd just appointed her as Deputy Whip in the upper house, and you'd hardly do that of someone who was a bad character. The thing that I found shocking and frankly scandalous is that the judge found that she had been gravely wronged, and you'd think where you've done something which has gravely wronged someone on the basis of an untruth, that a decent human being would apologise abjectly and profusely, and then do whatever was within his power to rectify the situation. But in the wake of the judgment, John Pizzuto refused to apologise and refused to take any steps to have Moira readmitted to the party room. Well, she was expelled from the party room on the basis of a lie. So I would have thought ordinary human decency, quite apart from any proper respect for the court's judgment, would have led to John Pizzuto and his parliamentary colleagues wanting to have Moira back into the party room. And this palaver, it's not up to me, it's up to the members. Well, look, if the members received a suitable lead from John Pizzuto, of course she'd come back into the party room. So look, I think this is an ongoing scandal. Of course, I would like to see a change of government in Victoria as soon as possible. It's been a dreadful Labor government, but I just wish the local party was in a better state.
For her part, Moira has said that she wants to be back into the party, that she was unjustly expelled. My door is open if anyone wants to talk to me. I have every right to be there. I did nothing wrong. It's hard to argue with that.
Completely
particularly after
correct.
The judgment.
And look, it's an absolutely foul smear to accuse someone of being an associate of neo-Nazis, of having neo-Nazi sympathies. It's just a disgusting smear. And the idea that it should have been maintained at all because the leader was worried about Dan Andrews' attack on the Liberal Party. I mean, really and truly, the job of a leader is not to accommodate other people's lies.
Yeah.
It's to resist other people's lies. It's not to take the side of the Labor Party against one of your own members. It's to stand up for your own members against the Labor Party.
So is the current leadership of the Liberal Party the right leadership, given what's happening, or what's your assessment of the future in that sense? There's still a couple of years to go, and if you look at the polling, the actual Liberals have been increasing because Labor have been declining as the economy comes off. What's your assessment of sort of the leadership future there?
Well, naturally, I would like to see a change of government in Victoria, and I would like to maximise the chances of a change of government in Victoria by having the local party put its house in order. And the best way for that to happen would be for John Pizzuto to be man enough to say, look, I got it wrong, I made a mistake, I'm very sorry for my mistake, I apologise to Moira Deeming, and I will do my best to make it up to her. And the best way to do that would be for me to move her readmission into the party room.
Okay, we'll wait and see if that's forthcoming. Hopefully it is. I want to move now to international affairs. So you've been overseas recently, including in the United States, where I know you met with Vice President-elect J.D. Vance. Are you able to share with us what you were doing and what you learned about, in particular, the transition to Trump Mark II and how that's shaping up for the world and for America?
Yes, Dan. Well, I was at the International Democratic Union conference in Washington, and I was then at a subsequent Danube Institute conference, and then I went to the Wall Street Journal CEO Forum, which is an annual event. So I did get quite a good chance to take stock of where things are at in America. The interesting thing about the recent election is that it was a very strong win for the Republicans and for Donald Trump. And this time, unlike in 2016, it was unambiguous. And this time, unlike in 2016, the voters knew what they were doing. I mean, Trump was a unknown quantity in 2016, or a little known quantity in 2016. We know exactly what he's like now. We know his strengths, we know his weaknesses, and he was elected with a strong popular vote, with a strong electoral college mandate, and with a workable majority in both the House and the Senate. So this is a big win. It's also an emphatic repudiation of the politics of climate and identity, which was so championed by the Green, left, woke Democrat Party. And I think it is quite properly being seen as a morale booster for strong centre-right politics throughout the world, but particularly in the Anglosphere. So I'm very encouraged by Donald Trump's election. I think it was one of the very significant global events of the last year, along with Israel's magnificent fight back against its Iranian and Iranian-backed foes. I think probably the most encouraging things about 2024 globally were the second coming of Donald Trump and the Israeli fight back. So let's be grateful for those, but we now have to hope that the second Trump administration is substantially more effective than the first. And we also have to hope that, having largely degraded and destroyed Hamas, having triumphed over Hezbollah, that Israel can now see off the long-term Iranian nuclear threat, and that's obviously something that remains very serious and very substantial.
And looking ahead to next year, what is your assessment of the key things to look for? Obviously, we've got the federal election, there's a state election in WA, we've got the Trump administration coming in, as we've just discussed. What are you going to be looking for next year? And to give us an indication, we just talked about how we're making progress. I think the centre-right in Australia is making progress. What sort of, I guess, beachheads are you going to be looking for to see whether we are able to continue that progress or whether it's been, somewhat limited?
Well, Dan, look, obviously for us, the election early next year is critical. As I keep saying, I think Anthony Albanese is a decent human being, but I think he's been, to put it kindly, a real disappointment as Prime Minister. I don't think he's grown in the job. I think the voice was a terrible mistake. I think the way the government has equivocated over the rampant anti-Jewish racism, let's not call it anti-Semitism, let's call it anti-Jewish racism, because it is racism pure and simple. Just because it's against the Jews doesn't make it any more abhorrent than if it was against Aboriginal people or Asian people or whatever. It's anti-Jewish racism, and the government has equivocated constantly over this. It says it's called it out. Well, tepidly and half-heartedly it has, but it hasn't stamped it out, and that's what's really needed. So we've got an election next year. I think we really need a change of government. I think our country is clearly drifting backwards. On the latest polls, 59% of Australians say they're worse off now than 3 years ago. Roughly 2/3 of us think our country is headed in the wrong direction. Well, best way to change direction is to vote for someone who actually believes in our country and in the Australian flag and is not going to destroy our energy system by basing it on unreliable, intermittent renewable power and compromise our long-term economic security by ending two of our three biggest exports. So that's super important. More broadly, I think there's, if you like, an upside and a potential downside. Looking at the upside first, I am starting to become optimistic that we might be at the point of peak woke, and we might be moving away from the woke mind virus. We might be recovering finally from the woke mind virus. Trump's election in 2016 was an indication that the public were unhappy with the woke mind virus, but in the end, that turned out to be a false dawn. Likewise, the Brexit vote, I think, was a sign that the British public wanted to reclaim their country from an effete establishment and its European obsessions. I think our vote against the Voice, again, was a big sign of the way the public wanted to go. But those three earlier events didn't change the direction of officialdom. I think this Trump election will change our direction. It'll certainly change the direction of the United States, and I think over time it'll help to change the direction of the wider world. So that's the upside. The downside is the ongoing threat of the dictatorships. It's been a tough year for the heroic Ukrainians. Yes, they had that lightning strike into Russia, which was quite successful, but they're still under enormous military pressure. Yes, they've developed some ingenious ways of striking back inside Greater Russia, but again, it's still a David and Goliath struggle, and you'd have to say that at the moment, Goliath, the tyrant, is looking strong. There is still the Iranian nuclear threat hanging over Israel and over the Middle East more generally. And of course, we've got a Beijing regime that is desperate to take Taiwan. There was a very interesting piece by Mike Pizzullo in the Australian over the weekend where he was talking about hard and soft patriotism. We Australians are good at soft patriotism. We're happy to go out and feel good about ourselves on Australia Day. We're happy to turn up and wave flags at the old diggers on Anzac Day. I'm not sure that we are prepared militarily, economically and psychological for the challenges that could easily come. Pizzulo still thinks that major war in our region is unlikely, but he puts its chances at about 20%. That's not an insignificant chance. And were it to happen, Australia would be called upon to make a much more serious contribution than we have to any conflict really since the Second World War. So I think we need as a nation to gird our loins in many different ways. We need to strengthen our armed forces. We need to stop all of the economic self-harm that we're doing in the name of climate change. And we need to remember that we are not only a great country, but we are a great country that needs to defend itself and that needs to contribute to the protection of freedom and justice in the wider world.
Mm-hmm. I just want to pick up on one thing there, maybe to round it out, which is on sort of the topic of leadership. And you mentioned about Anthony Albanese's been a disappointing Prime Minister. I was reflecting on this when we had the debate about the flags, and it struck me that Anthony Albanese has never actually explained to the community why he thinks that's a good thing. And then it got me thinking, well, I can't actually remember Anthony Albanese ever telling me what he believes. He's never really enunciated it. Now, maybe he's done it when he was a junior minister or when he first came into politics, but when people voted for you, when they voted for John Howard, they had a broad understanding of what it is that you were about, and they might agree or disagree, but they go, look, I know what Tony thinks, I know what John Howard thinks, I know what I'm getting. I don't understand, but he's never really actually explained to the community, okay, why do we need 3 flags? He sort of then just attacks Peter Dutton rather than communicating it.
Look, this is a very fair point, Dan. You're right. John Howard had a very long public career where he had taken a stand on various issues, and I always used to say that the golden thread that ran through John Howard's public life was support for traditional institutions, the family and small business. And certainly when I became Prime Minister, I'd written a couple of books. I'd made many carefully scripted speeches on lots of topics. I'd been involved in public life as a student politician to the extent that that counts, and as a journalist and a commentator, as well as a member of Parliament and minister. I'd been a columnist for 10 years at the Adelaide Review. I'd written a column for the Sydney Morning Herald for 3 or 4 years. So I was very much a known quantity. A lot of people these days get to the top almost without trace. I can remember thinking of Theresa May, that she'd risen without trace to the British Prime Ministership because, sure, she'd been Home Secretary and she'd done the things that Home Secretaries do, but she'd never made, to the best of my recollection, any, I suppose, deeper appraisal of what the Home Secretary's job was about and what the fundamentals of what she was trying to achieve were. And in every portfolio that I'd ever been in, I'd always done that. Now, I think that this is a real problem in our politics. It's a real problem in our politics. Too many people aren't prepared to tell us what they really think, and they aren't prepared to say what they believe on the big topics, on all the big issues of life and death, the great questions. Why am I here? What should I do? How do we know? I mean, these big existential questions, the people who lead our countries should share their thoughts with us. And I guess that was the interesting thing about the recent Joe Rogan podcast with both Donald Trump and J.D. Vance, particularly the J.D. Vance podcast. It was a magnificent performance. I disagreed with J.D. where he said just at the very end of the podcast that he thought the Iraq War was America's greatest geostrategic catastrophe, and he thought it was a big mistake that post-war America had tried to recreate the world in its own image. Well, frankly, a world in America's image might be a bit crass in some respects, but I tell you, hell of a lot better than a world in communist China's image. And sure, the Iraq War didn't end well in terms of its short-term aftermath, but the fault was not the attempt to get rid of a monstrous dictator in Iraq. The fault was the immediate disbandment of the Iraqi army, which meant 500,000 unemployed people with guns, and the immediate disbandment of the Ba'athist civil service, which meant that the civilian infrastructure collapsed. That was the mistake, not the attempt to give Iraq a better government and to give Iraqi people a better life. So look, but to get back to the Joe Rogan, J.D. Vance podcast, a wonderful exposition by a very, very fine and very well-rounded, very thoughtful person of his thinking on a whole range of issues in conversation with someone who wasn't giving him a soft run, who was challenging him, testing him, probing him. And if more of our leaders and potential leaders were prepared to do that, I think we would have a better democracy and certainly a better class of leader.
Do you reckon they have the capacity to do it? I mean, like a lot of them, it seems to me it's very poll-driven. And, if you were to ask people in a survey, do you want, a leader to say this or that, they'll say no. So they get sort of, I'll just stick to the soundbite. But where it's actually going is particularly young people will watch these 3 or 4 hour podcasts because they're sick and tired of the usual corporate political spin and they can see through it. They're after authenticity. I just wonder how many politicians in our parliament could sit down for 3 hours and actually have a conversation. Do you reckon there's many?
Well, I think some would be much better at it than others because I think some are just more thoughtful, better informed, more widely read, etc. But certainly anyone who aspires to be our leader ought to be capable of it and should be less anxious about doing it. Now, I've got to be candid with you, Dan. I mean, when I was the party leader, I was, on some topics in particular, I was careful not to give unnecessary hostages to fortune and not to make more enemies than was absolutely strictly necessary. So being politic, in inverted commas, is understandable and fair enough in its own way. But you would like to think that people who aspire to lead countries have thought at length and in depth about all the big issues and can make sense of them.
Alrighty, well I reckon we'll leave it there for today, Tony. So thanks for a great year and Merry Christmas to yourself.
Hope you might have me back next year, Dan.
I think we will, Tony. I think we'll kick off our next season somewhere around Australia Day. So thanks for a great year. I know you've got a busy schedule flying around everywhere, so we always appreciate you making time. And Merry Christmas to yourself and your family.
Thanks, Dan.
This is a production of the Centre for the Australian Way of Life at the Institute of Public Affairs. To find out more, visit australia.ipa.org.au.